If we're going to talk about Moneyball, then we have to start by talking about Billy Beane. He is the central figure of the book. When I went back and reread Moneyball in preparation for this series, I was surprised by just how much of the book was really a kind of mini biography of Billy Beane. Of course, the book also covers people like Scott Hatteberg and Bill James and the 2002 baseball season in general, but the real star of the show was the Oakland A's general manager. So much so that a lot of people who hated that book when it came out incorrectly assumed that Beane had written it himself. Michael Lewis, the book's real author, felt kind of bad about that, as I said back in my first video. He hadn't intended to make the book so much about one person. It was just that Beane was a really interesting guy, and he was so cooperative with Lewis, letting him see the ins and outs of Oakland's process during the 2002 season. And Michael Lewis, who is one of the best nonfiction writers in the world, has a way of making people like Beane really leap off the page. And Beane is an interesting guy. Not only that, but he was interesting in a specific way that really captured something about what was changing in baseball front offices at the time. See, if you look at how baseball teams were run for most of the 20th century, before the Moneyball revolution, the key figure in any franchise was usually the manager. Guys like Tommy Lasorda, Sparky Anderson, Earl Weaver, or Leo DeRocher, these guys had big, colorful personalities and reputations as on-field geniuses. By contrast, a team's general manager was typically a more anonymous figure, operating behind the scenes. There were certainly some who were known around the game, like Branch Rickey or George Wise, but in 2002, when Michael Lewis was following Beane, there were only 4 people in the Baseball Hall of Fame primarily for their work as GMs, as opposed to 16 who were in as managers. Maybe even more telling was the way you got to be a general manager. These guys were usually baseball lifers, former players and scouts who often spent their whole life employed by a single team, working their way up from the bottom. Someone like Jim Campbell, who got hired as the business manager of the Detroit Tigers rookie ball affiliate out of college, and then worked his way up to be the team's general manager for 20 years, helping to build 2 World Series winners, all with Detroit. But if you look at baseball teams today, you see something very different. For one, executives are way more famous than they used to be, and for almost every team, they are more important than the manager. You can see this, for example, in the fuss about the Mets hiring David Stearns, which was treated almost like a major free agent signing. Or how even a future Hall of Fame manager like Joe Maddon was fired a couple years ago in part for not being deferential enough to the front office. And then there's the makeup of those front offices, which are, first of all, bigger than they used to be. Teams now have not just a general manager, but often a team president, which is a position that didn't really exist in its current form until a few years ago. Teams kind of invented it so they could keep more talent in their front offices. And that talent is younger than it used to be. No longer are GMs and team presidents baseball lifers who work their way up from the bottom. They're often barely lifers at anything. Many are barely out of college. Andrew Friedman, for example, got hired by the Tampa Bay Rays. They were still the Devil Rays then, actually, just 5 years after finishing business school, and became general manager when he was only 28 years old. Theo Epstein was 29 years old when he was first hired by the Boston Red Sox as GM. Brian Cashman became the general manager of the Yankees at 31. David Stearns was hired by Milwaukee at 30. But it's not just that these guys are young. Young GMs weren't unheard of in the old days. It's also the background that these guys have, which often includes either advanced degrees, elite undergraduate educations at Ivy League schools, or both. Theo Epstein went to Yale and had a law degree. Andrew Friedman went to Harvard. Ben Cherington went to Amherst. A.J. Preller and John Daniels went to Cornell. Mike Elias went to Yale. If you look at baseball GMs in 2024, as of this recording, 9 of the 29 current GMs have Ivy League degrees, plus another one from Stanford, one from Amherst, and an MBA from the University of Chicago. And often, they got their start very far from baseball, either on Wall Street or at some elite consulting firm. Cardinals GM Mike Gersh, for example, worked at the Boston Consulting Group before moving into baseball. Jeff Luhnow, the controversial architect of the Houston Astros dynasty, had a whole career in consulting and logistics before getting into the game. In other words, instead of hiring old, tried-and-true baseball guys who had been around the game forever and had specialized baseball knowledge, teams started hiring younger guys whose pedigree evoked a general sense of intelligence and innovation. Whether that intelligence and innovation had been applied to relief pitching or shipping logistics was not especially relevant. So the effect was that people running baseball teams started to look a lot more like the people running any big business in America. Part of what made Billy Beane so interesting, though, and such an important figure in expediting this trend, was how he sort of straddled the two worlds. He was young, just 35 when he became the general manager in Oakland, but he had no elite educational background. He never even went to college, having been drafted right out of high school. He was a baseball lifer, having worked his way up from minor leaguer to scout to GM, but he had no allegiance to the traditional ways of doing things, and he was not just willing but eager to think outside the box. He didn't hire all those young nerds who populated Oakland's front office. Paul DePodesta and J.P. Ricciardi had been hired by Beane's predecessor, Sandy Alderson, but Beane was willing to listen to them as much or more than he listened to the old scouts. He had the temper of old-school baseball icons like Lasorda and DeRocher. There are stories in the book about Billy Beane throwing chairs and that he can't even watch games because he gets too emotional. But in the end, he's an executive who tries to be completely objective and neutral about his team. In other words, Beane was this fascinating mix of old school and new school, and because of that, he came to symbolize some much bigger economic trends. And it's important to say that he was not the only cause, or even the biggest cause of these trends. As mentioned, the A's had been heading in this direction before Beane became the general manager, and you could really see evidence of these trends in other teams around the league at the same time, like in Cleveland, where Mark Shapiro was the general manager, or New York, where Brian Cashman was working. It's just that Billy Beane was the only one that Michael Lewis thought was interesting enough to write a whole book about. But what made Beane so interesting was his unique background. Getting drafted at 18, the years spent in the minor leagues, the emotional ties to the game. That made for an interesting story, and yet as the trends spread around the game, the more common story of a team's executive would be something much simpler. Some guy went to an Ivy League school and got a really good job out of college, and now they're basically running the team from the front office. You can find that story in practically any large company in the country. The GMs who followed in Beane's footsteps, they're nowhere near as interesting as Beane himself, but they're still the ones making the big decisions for a team. The degree to which teams are run by the bean counters and the smart guys in the front office is a real legacy of Moneyball. In the movie, much of the drama comes from a power struggle between Billy Beane and the team's manager, Art Howe. There's scenes where Philip Seymour Hoffman, who played Howe, sighs and folds his arms and tells Billy he's ruining the team. But that conflict was really exaggerated for the film. In the book, everyone acknowledges that Billy Beane is in charge. As one player says, quote, he runs the team from the weight room. By contrast, in the book, Howe is basically a non-entity who has almost no say in what the team does. Sure, he might be technically making the pitching changes and filling out the lineup cards and giving the signs, but he was doing so under the watchful eye of Billy Beane and the guys crunching the data in the front office. That was a huge departure when the book came out, but honestly, now it's pretty standard across all baseball teams. It's not that managers have no influence or no importance, but their role is significantly diminished from what it once was. They're accountable to the Ivy League guys in the front office now. I think a lot about A.J. Hinch's role in the Astros sign-stealing scheme from 2017. He didn't start that scheme, and in fact he disapproved of it, going so far as to break the monitors to signal his feelings about it. But he never told the players or his bench coach Alex Cora to knock it off, even though the players later told the league that they would have stopped if he had told them to. Why would a well-respected manager like A.J. Hinch silently stew about cheating and break monitors and throw little fits, but never actually tell the players to cut it out? Because he likely knew that he wasn't really in charge. The players had the tacit approval of the front office, and it wasn't the manager's place to step in. He wasn't really running the team. The front office was running the team. Obviously, this is an extreme example, and it's not that Moneyball inevitably led to the Houston cheating scandal, but the idea of a manager as a figurehead, of a team really being run by young, smart guys in the front office who are looking for every conceivable edge in the data, that did start with Moneyball. Now, usually the effects are more benign, but if we want to really get into those effects, we have to talk more about the data, which brings us to the next subject in the Moneyball revolution, the statistics, which we're going to talk about in our next video.